I was not expecting Count Your Blessings to turn into such a big drama. After I made that last video talking about it, Twitter just exploded into people calling for bans and doom posting on the format. It isn't anywhere in the ballpark of power level that people are complaining about it. So in this video, I'm going to be going over the silver bullet cards that you can use to beat Count Your Blessings and go over the different strategies that you can use against these style of decks. First, you need to understand your enemy. What is the Count Your Blessings decks trying to do? At its core, it's a fatigue strategy, where you're trying to win the game by either running your opponent out of cards or stalling long enough that you can take over in the late game. Typically, if you slam your 4 to 5 card hand into a fatigue deck every turn, you aren't going to have enough damage to actually win the game. So the non-fatigue deck will usually take setup turns where they try to have a really big next turn where they push over the block value of the fatigue deck. The entire strength of Count Your Blessings is to punish these setup turns. I wanted to block with these cards, but since you didn't give me a chance to block, I guess I'll gain some life. So now that we understand this, let's dive into the silver bullet cards that you can play against them to gain an edge against the strategy. The first big one is anti-life gain cards, and I think the one that really comes to mind here is Poison the Well. This card is huge against Count Your Blessings decks. It being a blue means that you can keep pitching it back into your deck until later on in the game when the Count Your Blessings have really ramped up in value. And if you can line it up against the last one that they cast, it's about a 20-point swing. The 9th Count Your Blessings that you end up casting is going to be worth 8 plus 1, 2, or 3 depending on the pitch color of it. So if you play a Poison the Well, it's going to be worth double that amount because you're preventing them from gaining that life and then dealing them that much damage instead. So depending on the pitch color of the Count Your Blessings, the Poison the Well is going to be worth 18, 20, or 22 value for one card. Plus, your opponent had to spend 2 cards. They just wasted. Then, of course, we have the Runeblade weapons of Dread Scythe and Reaping Blade. Dread Scythe's main strength is you can actually put it in a Count Your Blessings deck yourself and kind of play this control game and have a bit of an edge in that mirror match, where Reaping Blade, you're just playing into this deck because you're trying to actually kill them. And then you have to pay like a little bit of a dance with them, trying to make sure you keep dipping below them, which can be difficult. Now, what I like way more than the anti-life gain cards is Grave Disruption, and my favorite for this is Gravekeeping. It's generic, it's a 1 for 5, you can throw it in any deck, and you just get to banish one of their Count Your Blessings from the graveyard. If you hit the first one that they cast before they've played any others, this is a 13-point swing. You've got the 5 value from the Gravekeeping itself, and then you have the incidental life gain that your opponent would have gained from having that Count Your Blessings in their graveyard. So that's 8 instances of 1 that they're not going to see later on for life gain. In a similar vein, we have Passover, just instant speed way to get rid of it from their graveyard. And while we're on Mystic, we got to talk about all of the new cards. You've got the Sacred Art, you've got Bonds of Attraction and Memory, where if they hit, you're able to banish a card from their graveyard. And in the case of the Sacred Art, you get 2 cards, and you don't have to hit. It just happens. They don't have any way to interact with this. Now, this doesn't work with Bonds of Agony, unfortunately, because they would just play the card in response. They're not going to let the Bonds of Agony hit and go, oh, that's unfortunate. I have a Count Your Blessings in my hand. I guess I'm not going to play it, and I'll just let you banish it. They're going to play it in response. And then New actually has the added benefit where maybe she herself is a very good Count Your Blessings deck in those mirror matches, because if you banish their blue Count Your Blessings, well, you can just play them, and then it's going to see all the ones that you have, so you can gain even more life than you're supposed to. That's crazy. Then we have the Shadow Heroes. For Levia, we have Deadwood Rumbler, and then for Vincent, we have Invert Existence. Deadwood just gets it out of the graveyard, very similar to the Gravekeeping. And then in case of Invert, you miss out on the value of not getting to deal damage with it, but the life that you prevent them from gaining is probably worth it in that exchange, depending on how early into the game you're able to actually cast this. And then another card that anyone can put into their deck is Talisman of Cremation. The caveat is you have to be able to play cards from Banish, which makes this sound like it's also a shadow card, but weirdly enough, there's a lot of decks that do just randomly play cards from their Banish. Ninja's a great example of this. You've got the Tigers that come from Banish, Katsu's Hero Power, you've got Mask of the Pouncing Lynx, Double Strike. There's tons of Ninja cards that just play from Banish. Bonds. Dory was singing Steel Blade. And of course the Shadow Heroes, as we already mentioned. I'm sure there's even more examples of this that I'm forgetting right now, but It's a card that you should look and go, hey, does my deck actually have anything that plays from Banish at all? Because if I can, this is an absolute house. If you can hit multiple of their Count Your Blessings, you probably win the game on the spot because it's so much value you took out of their deck. I think more valuable than adding in silver bullet tech cards to your deck, though, is understanding the macro of the matchup and how to approach thinking about the game itself. These tips will not only help you against Count Your Blessings decks right now, but help you tackle fatigue decks in the future. First big tip is creating more total deck damage than them. By this I mean we're trying to create some sort of extra damage beyond just if we flipped over our decks and counted up the numbers on our cards. And this is done through creating damage from recursive threats. So this could be like, cards that go back to your deck or your hand after using them, like Evergreen, Rites of Replenishment, Endless Arrow, Gone in a Flash, things like this, where you get to keep playing over and over again. Or your weapon is a great example of that. Leaning into your weapon is a great way to add more damage. Your weapon is frequently your best tool against fatigue decks, since it's free damage every single turn. In some cases, using this strategy, you can actually reverse Uno fatigue the fatigue player. Attacking is generally more efficient than blocking in both terms of card value, but also card economy in the sense of what's going to the grave versus what's going back into your deck. For example, let's say we use 4 cards on offense and present 12 damage, but one of them was a card used as pitch to cover the turn. Your opponent, on the other hand, blocks with all 4 cards for 12. In this scenario, they're putting 4 cards in their graveyard, you're putting 3 in yours, but 1 back into your deck. So, in that sense, you're up 1 card on them in total deck damage. And you can utilize this strategy to fatigue the fatigue deck, especially if they're not attacking you back very often. If you're able to do this, or you think you're close to being able to do this, where you're finding a lot of games get down to them having just a few cards left in deck, and if you just had a few more, maybe you could have won, consider going above 60 cards. I've done this in the past. A good example of that was back in the Lexi Oldhim meta. I played a few extra cards in my deck in that matchup because I found sometimes I would reach end state scenarios where I just needed like 1 more turn, and then I actually deck them out, and then I could end up winning with like an Endless Arrow as my weapon, essentially. Or maybe I just got them so low that I just needed like 1 more turn of attacking them where I leak just a few points over their hand, and if I just had that 1 more turn left, I could have killed them. But you do have a downside to the strategy, where if you add extra cards to your deck, you are diluting the consistency of your deck, so you have to consider how your deck is constructed and if it actually works going above 60. Next big tip is push, push, push. Just keep attacking. The strength of Count Your Blessings is how it punishes off turns from the opponent. The weakness of that, though, is you have a lot of non-blocks in your deck, and it takes a long time to ramp up in value with these Count Your Blessings. If you just keep pushing, it can be very hard for these decks to find spots to profitably play these life gain cards. And in that same space, on-hits are very good against them. They're playing less cards that physically block than a normal fatigue deck would. So if you just keep presenting on-hits that are difficult to defend against, hitting, breakpoints or something, like snatches, it can be very hard for them to actually physically defend against these, and then it generates a lot of extra value for you, where you're able to then leak damage in over their block value. So to summarize, take less setup turns, just keep pushing, don't give them space to play these life gain cards, punish them for their deck construction. And this then goes into our next point of shortening the game. As I mentioned, it takes a while to ramp up in value with Count Your Blessings. The first ones you're casting are really bad. They're really bad. Even at the red, you're playing a 2-card 3. It's not good. I really need to hammer this home with you guys. The value of this effect is countering setup turns. Just playing them normally is not good. Even once you finish casting all of them, let's say you cast all 9 copies, pitching a full card to play all of them, and you did nothing else with the extra resources that you might have had as you played them. It's 18 cards you're spending to gain 54 life. This is exactly 3 points of value per card, which is just on rate in Flesh and Blood. So, if you're able to shorten the game and prevent the game from even getting to the point that they can cast all 9 of them because they get too low, it severely tanks the value of this card. And then they look silly for sitting there all game playing these 2-card 3s. The next big tip is going over the top of what they can block. Now, this can be difficult when you're not taking setup turns, but some decks are able to do this. A great example of that is Aurora, with your Arc Lightning plus Flicker Wisp combo, you can generate a ton of value in one turn and just push their life down really low really quick. And we're able to do things like this that then goes into our previous point of shortening the game. If you're able to have these really big turns and just make the game really condensed, it makes it very easy to minimize the value that they're getting out of this life gain. If all else fails and none of this works for you, just play a deck that they need to put pressure on, like Enigma. That's what I'm doing. I'm a one-head, so I'm just going to play Enigma and face roll them, because it's really difficult for them to actually put meaningful pressure on a deck like that. They need to clear my board or I will run away with the game. Prism could potentially be another great example of this. Just, decks that are able to create board states and create unsurmountable advantages if you don't deal with what they're doing. In the past, I think I would have said Pheano is another good example of this, because if you just give him infinite time, he will set up a pitch stack combo that kills you, but that might be difficult through all of this life gain. We'll have to see. So now that you know what's good against Count Your Blessings decks, I think it's just as important to talk about what isn't good into them, because I've seen a lot of people talk about playing these kinds of decks and strategies into them, and it's not as good as some people may think. Good example of this is going to be Intimidate, Dominate, and Split Arcane Damage, where some of your damage is physical, some of it is in Arcane. In the case of Dominate, we could look at something like Azalea. She gets a lot of her value from the fact that you can't defend against what she's doing. But think about it from the Fatigue deck side. If they're able to block and then play their life gain card afterwards, it's almost like they blocked. So what was the point of the Dominate? In the case of Azalea, it's probably better just instead to throw an even bigger attack rather than dominate the arrow given the choice, unless you're presenting lethal. Then things change. We'll get back to that in a minute. And the same goes for Rhinar. His value proposition against Fatigue decks is not letting you block with your cards. But as I keep saying, I wanted to block with these cards, but he didn't let me, so I will gain life instead. Now with Split Arcane Damage, the value proposition there is just how inefficient it is to defend against. But if it's just raw damage with no added value behind it for hitting with the Arcane Damage, life gain perfectly counters that. In all these cases, presenting more damage is usually better than presenting tricky damage that's hard for them to defend against. Unless, of course, as I said, you're presenting lethal, which is a strength that these decks can have, where if you're able to play out the early game where you just pressure really, really hard, you can then get to the end game where you have these tools to close very easily once you've gotten your opponent low. Don't give them a chance to gain the life now that you've gotten them that low. I really hope this was helpful. I know Fatigue decks can be very difficult to play against. At some point, I'm going to try making a more comprehensive guide on how to beat Fatigue, but for now, if you guys have any questions, just drop them in the comments below, or if you think that I've missed anything, let everyone else know in the comments. This is a very deep subject, and I'm sure I didn't cover everything. But at the end of the day, Count Your Blessings isn't broken. If you followed this channel for any amount of time, you know that I call it like I see it. If I see something's messed up, or I see something's broken, I'm gonna call it out. If you're dooming on this card, well, I'm sorry if this isn't what you want to hear, though, but this is a tough love moment. Get good. Sit down, put in the time, learn how to beat Fatigue decks. Fatigue decks prey on their opponent being inefficient and punishes them for making mistakes. You will usually get to play a game of solitaire into them, so it's on you to find a way to win. And once you find a repeatable way to win the matchup, it's going to flip instantly from you losing every time to you winning every time. I know you can do it. I believe in you. Believe in the Pheano that believes in you. You can do it. Beat Fatigue. If you got value out of this video though, please consider subscribing to the channel and check out the Patreon to support more content like this. It gives me the ability to spend more time on the channel making more content for all of you. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate all of you.